When Brussels sent Elon Musk a private warning, they expected silence. They expected submission. They expected the world's most powerful private citizen to bow his head, quietly comply, and disappear from the conversation like every other tech executive they had crushed before him. Instead, at 2:47 in the morning, Musk did something so calculated, so deliberately devastating, that by sunrise, the entire European political establishment was in full crisis mode. A single post, a leaked screenshot, and a woman who commands the fate of 450 million people, suddenly unable to say a single word. What Elon Musk did next didn't just embarrass Ursula von der Leyen. It exposed the rotting infrastructure of power she has spent a decade building in secret. And once you see what was in that screenshot, you will never look at Brussels the same way again. To understand why this moment hit like a political earthquake, you have to go back to what Brussels actually believed about Elon Musk. Inside the marble corridors of the European Commission, there existed a quiet institutional consensus, a shared assumption held by von der Leyen's inner circle, her senior commissioners, and the legal architects of the Digital Services Act, that Musk was ultimately manageable. That beneath the bravado, beneath the late-night posts and the trolling and the chaos, there was a businessman who valued access to the European market too much to genuinely fight back. They had tamed Google. They had fined Meta into compliance. They had watched Amazon restructure its entire European operation to satisfy their demands. Every Silicon Valley giant, when pushed hard enough by Brussels, had eventually bent the knee. And so when the European Commission's DSA Enforcement Division dispatched what insiders now describe as a structured legal notice to X's European headquarters, they were not bracing for a war. They were expecting a transaction. The notice itself was not made public, which is precisely what made it so powerful as a weapon. Regulatory ambiguity is Brussels' sharpest blade. When the Commission sends a private warning without publishing its exact demands, the recipient faces an impossible choice: comply in the dark, where no one can see you surrendering, or resist publicly and hand Brussels the narrative of a reckless American billionaire defying European law. Every company before Musk had chosen the first option: quiet compliance, invisible submission. The machinery of European regulatory power runs on this silence. It is fed by it. It depends on it. And Ursula von der Leyen, who has mastered the art of regulatory warfare more completely than any Commission president in modern history, had every reason to believe the pattern would hold. It did not hold, not even slightly. At 2:47 a.m. Central European Time, while the Commission's legal team was almost certainly asleep, Elon Musk opened X on his phone and typed a message that was not accidental, not impulsive, and not the product of an exhausted mind making a reckless mistake. Every word of it was a scalpel. He did not rant, he did not threaten, he did not post a lengthy manifesto. He posted something far more dangerous: a question. A single, surgical, public question directed at Ursula von der Leyen by name, asking why the European Commission was sending private legal demands to X while simultaneously refusing to make those demands transparent to the European public. He asked, in plain language that required no legal interpretation, whether the institution tasked with protecting European democracy was itself operating without democratic accountability. And then he tagged the post with one additional line that made Brussels' blood run cold. He said the full documentation would be released within 48 hours. The reaction inside the Commission building on the Rue de la Loi was not measured. It was not strategic. By the accounts of 3 separate European political journalists who were tipped off within the hour, it was panic. Aides were woken up. Legal teams were contacted through emergency channels. Communication directors were pulled from their beds to draft holding statements that would satisfy the press without confirming the substance of what Musk had implied. The challenge they faced was brutal in its simplicity. If they denied the warning existed and Musk released the documentation, the Commission would be caught in a public lie. A catastrophic outcome for an institution whose entire authority rests on the perception of procedural legitimacy. If they confirmed the warning existed, they would be validating Musk's central claim, that Brussels was operating in the shadows, making private demands of one of the world's most visited communication platforms, away from the eyes of the 450 million citizens those demands were supposedly designed to protect. Von der Leyen's communications team chose a third path, which was in many ways the most damaging of all. They said nothing. For 6 hours after Musk's post exploded across X, accumulating millions of impressions and dragging the hashtag Brussels, exposed to the top of trending lists across Germany, France, Italy, and the Netherlands, the European Commission issued no statement, no clarification, no pushback, and no denial. The silence was not dignified. It was paralysed. And the European press, which has spent years giving the Commission the benefit of the doubt on matters of digital regulation, began to notice. Politico Europe ran its first query to the Commission press office at 4:15 a.m. They received an automated acknowledgement. The Financial Times followed at 5:30 a.m. Same result. By the time European morning shows were going live, anchors were openly asking why the most powerful regulatory body on the continent had gone completely dark in response to a single social media post from a man in America. The leaked screenshot changed everything. It appeared on X at 6:22 a.m., posted by an account with no prior history of political leaks, no follower base to speak of, and no identifying information beyond a creation date, 3 weeks earlier. The screenshot showed what appeared to be an internal Commission communication thread, not the formal legal notice sent to X, but something far more revealing. It was a strategy discussion, a conversation between senior DSA enforcement officials about the sequencing of regulatory pressure on X, the preferred timeline for escalation, and the phrase that detonated across European media like a depth charge, the explicit acknowledgement that the goal of the enforcement action was not merely compliance with European content rules, but the forcing of what the document called structural editorial alignment on the platform's algorithmic content distribution. 3 words that to anyone fluent in the language of platform regulation meant something very specific and very alarming. Brussels was not trying to make X follow the rules. Brussels was trying to make X change what its algorithm showed to European users, and it had been planning to do so quietly, through private legal pressure, without a single public debate, without a parliamentary vote, and without the knowledge of the 450 million people whose information environment it intended to reshape. Within minutes of the screenshot appearing, X itself was unmanageable. European politicians from across the spectrum, not just from the right, not just from Eurosceptic parties, but from liberal and centrist traditions that had reliably defended the Commission's digital agenda, began posting their alarm. A German FDP member of the European Parliament called for an emergency session of the Internal Market Committee. A Dutch MEP from the Liberal Renew Europe group, the same political family as von der Leyen's allies, publicly demanded that the Commission explain the phrase structural editorial alignment before the end of the business day. A former French minister, one who had served under Macron and spent years championing the DSA as a model for democratic internet governance, went on French radio and said, simply and without qualification, that if the screenshot was authentic, it represented an abuse of regulatory power with no precedent in the Commission's history. The Commission still said nothing, and the silence, stretching now across an entire morning, was beginning to look less like strategy and more like a confession. But what nobody in Brussels had yet realised, what von der Leyen's inner circle had not yet processed in the chaos of that morning, was that the 48-hour clock Musk had mentioned in his original post was not a bluff, not a negotiating tactic, and not a performative gesture designed to extract a quiet concession behind closed doors. Musk had been preparing for this moment for weeks, and what he was about to release would not just embarrass the Commission, it would name names, expose timelines, and reveal a pattern of private regulatory coercion so systematic, so deliberate, and so carefully hidden from public view that even the journalists who had covered Brussels for decades would struggle to believe it was real. The only question was whether von der Leyen would find a way to stop him before the clock ran out. She had 41 hours left, and not a single card left to play that Musk hadn't already accounted for. So what exactly was inside that second document that made even her closest allies start quietly distancing themselves from the Commission before nightfall? The second document was not a leak. That distinction matters enormously, because a leak implies accident, implies a disgruntled insider acting alone, implies a single thread that can be pulled and contained and quietly neutralised by the Commission's formidable crisis management apparatus. What Musk released at precisely 11 a.m. Central European Time, timed, observers noted, to coincide exactly with the opening of the European Parliament's morning session in Strasbourg, ensuring maximum institutional disruption, was a structured release, organised, indexed, accompanied by a brief explanatory note that laid out the chronology of events in numbered sequence, like a prosecutor presenting evidence to a jury that had already been waiting too long for the truth. It was not the work of a man venting frustration. It was the work of a man who had known this confrontation was coming and had spent considerable time deciding exactly how to win it. The documents ran to 47 pages. Not all of them were immediately digestible to a general audience, and Musk knew that. So alongside the raw documentation, X's own account posted a plain language summary, 11 bullet points, written with the kind of brutal clarity that bypasses legal jargon and lands directly in the gut of anyone paying attention. The first bullet point confirmed what the leaked screenshot had already suggested. The European Commission's DSA enforcement team had been conducting what the documents called a parallel track engagement with X, meaning that while formal public regulatory proceedings were being conducted through official channels, with timelines and transparency requirements and legal safeguards, a second, entirely separate conversation was happening privately, undocumented in public records, between senior Commission officials and X's European legal representatives. A conversation in which the demands being made bore little resemblance to the formal public proceedings and went significantly further in scope, in specificity, and in their implications for editorial independence. The second bullet point was where the room, figuratively speaking, across every newsroom, every parliamentary office, every Commission briefing room in Europe, went completely still. The documents showed that the private demands made to X were not limited to content moderation compliance, not limited to transparency reporting requirements, not limited to the removal of specific categories of illegal material as defined under European law. They extended to what the Commission officials had described, in their own internal language, as proactive friction implementation, a technical euphemism for the deliberate engineering of the platform's recommendation systems to reduce the organic reach of content that the Commission had internally categorised as it, and here the document used a phrase that would be quoted in every major European newspaper by that afternoon, narratively destabilising to institutional trust. Not illegal content, not hate speech, not incitement to violence. Content that the Commission had decided, in private, without legal definition, without parliamentary oversight, and without any mechanism for appeal, was too damaging to public faith in European institutions to be allowed to spread freely. To understand the full weight of what that phrase meant, you have to understand what the DSA was publicly sold as when von der Leyen championed its passage in 2022. The regulation was presented to the European public, to the European Parliament, and to the international press as a landmark piece of democratic legislation. A framework designed to protect citizens from the genuine harms of unregulated digital platforms, from algorithmic radicalization, from coordinated disinformation campaigns, from the unchecked power of American tech monopolies. It was framed, explicitly and repeatedly, as a tool for protecting free expression by ensuring platforms could not arbitrarily silence users, by mandating transparency in content moderation decisions, by giving European citizens the right to understand and contest the algorithmic systems shaping their information environment. That was the public argument. That was the democratic mandate on which the law was passed. And the documents Musk released showed, with the specificity of internal timestamps and named officials and verbatim communication threads, that behind that public mandate, a parallel agenda had been operating, one in which the Commission itself was doing precisely what the DSA had been designed to prevent, using private, opaque, unaccountable pressure to shape what European citizens were algorithmically permitted to see, based on the Commission's own internal judgment about which narratives were acceptable and which were too dangerous to allow to flourish. The hypocrisy was not subtle. It was not a matter of interpretation or political framing or the kind of nuanced legal debate that Brussels excels at generating to obscure uncomfortable realities. It was written, in the Commission's own words, in documents that now sat on the servers of the most visited social media platform on Earth, indexed, searchable, and spreading at a velocity that no crisis communications team on the planet could have contained. By noon, the downloads had surpassed 4 million. By 1 p.m, German public broadcaster ARD had assigned its entire digital investigations unit to verify the document's authenticity. By 2 p.m, 2 separate European cybersecurity firms had issued preliminary statements confirming that the metadata embedded in the documents was consistent with authentic Commission internal communications and showed no indicators of fabrication or manipulation. Von der Leyen's office finally broke its silence at 2:34 p.m. The statement, when it came, was a masterclass in saying nothing while appearing to say something. It acknowledged that the Commission engaged in ongoing dialogue with major digital platforms as part of its regulatory mandate, and stated that all such engagement was conducted in full accordance with applicable legal frameworks. It made no reference to the specific documents. It made no reference to the phrase narratively destabilising to institutional trust. It made no reference to proactive friction implementation. It made no reference to the 47 pages that had by then been read, cited, and debated in 4 languages across every major European media outlet. It was a statement designed not to address the crisis but to exist, to give Commission loyalists something to point to, some official text to hide behind, while the institution's legal team worked frantically in the background to find a response that did not constitute an implicit admission. It did not work. Because within 20 minutes of the Commission's statement being published, Elon Musk posted a single word in response. He posted it without context, without elaboration, without the lengthy explanatory note that had accompanied the morning's document release. He simply posted the word, page 31, and left it there for the world to interpret. Those who had already downloaded the document scrambled to page 31. Those who hadn't downloaded it yet rushed to do so. And what page 31 contained was something the Commission's carefully worded non-statement had conspicuously and entirely failed to address. It was a communication thread that did not involve X's legal team at all. It was an internal Commission discussion about a different platform entirely, and it suggested that the parallel track engagement model being used against X was not an isolated regulatory approach developed specifically for Musk's platform. It was a template, a repeatable, scalable methodology that had already been applied or was in active development for application to at least 3 other major digital platforms operating in Europe. Platforms whose users numbered in the hundreds of millions. Platforms that had, until that moment, given no public indication that they were operating under the same kind of private algorithmic pressure that the Commission had been applying to X. The implications detonated through the European political conversation with a force that made the morning's revelations look like a warm-up act. This was no longer a story about Elon Musk versus Ursula von der Leyen. This was no longer a story about X's compliance with European content rules, or the personal animosity between a contrarian American billionaire and the continent's most powerful unelected official. This had become a story about the systematic, institutionalized, deliberately hidden machinery through which the European Commission had been quietly engineering the information environment of 450 million people, and had been doing so not as an emergency measure, not as a temporary response to a specific crisis, but as a standing operational practice, refined over time, applied selectively, and shielded from public scrutiny by the very regulatory complexity the Commission had spent years deliberately cultivating. By 4 p.m, the European Parliament's Civil Liberties Committee had formally requested an emergency hearing. By 5 p.m, the governments of 3 member states, sources identified them as Hungary, Italy and the Netherlands, had issued formal diplomatic notes to the Commission requesting clarification. By 6 p.m, a coalition of 14 European civil liberties organisations had filed a joint legal challenge in the Court of Justice of the European Union, citing the documents as prima facie evidence of a fundamental breach of the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights. The Commission's legal fortress, built over a decade of patient institutional accumulation, was developing cracks in places that had never shown weakness before, and von der Leyen, who had spent 15 years mastering the internal politics of European power, who had survived scandals and challenges and institutional revolts that had destroyed lesser Commission presidents, was facing something her entire career had not prepared her for.